In this segment, we will be discussing the rise of fascism in Italy. After all, the term fascism is a Latin term, and it was first used to explain and describe the political regime that gains power in Italy in the early 1920s. Fascism emerged in Italy, and it gathered the political movement gathered pace around the leader of the fascist party, Benito Mussolini. What did the fascists do? They attacked liberalism and democracy as weak and inefficient, and they endorsed violence, power, and the cult of the nation as their linchpin ideologies. Let me give you a bit of a historical background, because you might wonder why Italy, what was going on in Italy, what was specifically going on in Italy. Together with Germany, right, Italy were the two major states that became unified from the from the 1850s onwards, in the latter part of the 19th century. Despite its strategic location, however, the Kingdom of Italy lacked economic, political, and military force to become a great power. Italian governments were, for the most part, weak and unstable. And at the start of the First World War, Italy was a member of the Central Powers Alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany. I should mention here that Italy did try to build a colonial empire. It succeeded to some extent to have a colonial possession in Libya, but that was it. So Italy enters the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, in 1915, and we are in a period of secret negotiations, there is a pact agreed in London between the Entente, Britain, France, and Italy, to effectively give promises to Italy that they would acquire more territory in the event of an Entente win, and maybe they would even be rewarded with some territory in the Ottoman Empire. So Italy therefore switches sides, joins the Entente, and expects territorial gains in case of victory. However, the problem with Italy, as we have seen, is that it exits the war victorious on the side of the victors. However, its war aims during the Paris Peace Settlement were not satisfied. So basically, there's a lot of resentment being built in the political elite of the country, that there were promises made with regards to Italy gaining more space and territories in Austria-Hungary, the neighboring region, or even in a colonial possession in the Ottoman Empire, and these promises were not kept by the British and the French. So this is the broader picture of Italy in the international sphere. Let's focus a bit more on the internal political context in Italy. In 1914, already at the time of the beginning of the war, members of the Italian Socialist Party formed a fascio. By fascio, we mean an association. That's what the term meant in Italian, to support Italy's entry into the war. Remember, Socialist Party, right? The term fasci was first used in 1915 by a socialist journalist, Benito Mussolini, who formed the so-called Fasci of Revolutionary Action. Fascists at the time thought war and violence would bring a revolution, and social revolution, and make Italy stronger. And many fascists saw the aftermath of the First World War as a national humiliation. What's interesting now is that although the fascist movement inspired by Mussolini during the First World War has this left-wing aura, if you will, it starts from a left-wing position. Then, after the end of the war, the movement changes totally direction. So in 1919, Mussolini forms the so-called Fasci di Combattimento, a new political association that goes against, purportedly goes against left-wing politics and right-wing conservatives. And who is Mussolini? He's a very instrumental figure because fascism revolves around him. As I said again, he was actually socialist, started off as a socialist journalist. However, he was expelled from the Socialist Party in 1914. Then he became the founder of the National Fascist Party, and he served as a prime minister, quasi-dictator of Italy for nearly 2 decades. Italy becomes a dictatorship in 1925, formally, and Mussolini is captured and killed by the resistance in 1943. And the key moment that the fascist movement that Mussolini builds, the key moment that this movement comes into power is the so-called March on Rome, and that happens in 1922. Remember the interesting, time scale here. 1922, we have a civil war in Ireland, we have a raging war in between Greece and Turkey. We have humanitarian challenges in places like Austria, Germany. Britain and France, the economy is kicking in. It's kind of growing, and there's a more optimistic flair of optimistic flavor of how the world is going to look. So at the same time, I'm trying to describe a picture in different parts of Europe. What happens in Italy is a political transformation of great magnitude. Thousands of party members of this new organization called the Fascists in black shirts demonstrate in Rome against the then weak prime minister. They call him weak, Facta. The then prime minister, who was democratically elected, asked for military help, but the king of the country, Italy at the time was a democracy, nonetheless, with the king playing a key role into politics. However, it was a constitutional democracy. The king refuses, the prime minister resigns, and then the king, and this is important, appoints the leader of this new movement, Mussolini, as the prime minister. So there's no elections. And after Mussolini is elected, then shortly thereafter, he proclaims a dictatorship in the country and rules and the fascist party becomes effectively the state. And this is one of the key moments in the consolidation of fascism in Italy. Mussolini changes the electoral law to guarantee his own victory in the 1924 elections. So there are elections, but nonetheless, they're gerrymandered in such a way that Mussolini will gain power. And after the establishment of the dictatorship, this was the last elections that Italy had, the party effectively controlled all state institutions and the private lives of citizens. Opposition parties were banned. And I keep referring to Mussolini because something that is really important to bear in mind is that fascism doesn't exist in the abstract. It really needs the presence of a leader. And Mussolini was very, very skillful in cultivating this image, this persona of the one leader that will lead a humiliated nation into a humiliated nation because it never became a great power in the way that it was imagined, to lead this nation into victory. His speeches, his own image, his ideas appeared everywhere in Italy. The regime became a personalistic regime. And at the same time, obviously, his consolidation of power marked the vehement expulsion of whoever disagreed with the fascist party. And there are wonderful films about that too. If you have seen, there's an Italian film, if you know, called the Il Conformista, the Conformist, which is after a book by Alberto Moravia, an Italian author who documents the story of two brothers, the Rosselli brothers, leaders of socialist democratic parties that were vehemently persecuted by Mussolini, and Mussolini ordered their execution. Now, I've hopefully given you a sense of how fascism gains foothold in Italy and what are the events that lead to that. And now, what I want to do now is give you a more abstract, if you will, understanding and definition of fascism. What is fascism? It is a political movement that embraces an extreme form of nationalism with violent militarism, authoritarian rule, and, crucially, the control of mass society through propaganda and technology. The fascist ideology in Italy was structured around the National Fascist Party, which aimed not only in maintaining power, but in controlling society in all its aspects. Fascism seeks to restore the power of a nation after a period of supposed decline, and looks towards a glorious past to imagine the future. And Mussolini, for instance, made a lot of references to the ancient glory of Rome, and he saw himself, and he projected through propaganda his own movement to be about restoring the ancient glory of the Italian nation. What are the core features of fascism? First, nationalism. Nationalism becomes its dominant ideology. And what do I mean by nationalism? It's not only loyalty and devotion to a nation, but the idea that pretty much not only that your nation is the best and ought to dominate over the rest. So it's also this idea of hierarchy here, that you need your national cause, your national identity is much better than any other national cause, any other national identity. And it's surely from that it follows that your country, your nation is destined to dominate. What is another aspect of fascism? Totalitarianism. What do we mean by this? A single mass party led by one man, which forms the hardcore of the regime, and it's typically superior to or intertwined with the governmental bureaucracy. At the same time, the party controls the state, and the state effectively works through a system of terror, using the police and the secret police directed against silencing any opposition. There's total control of the mass media. There's a real monopoly of weapons. There's a central control of the economy. And another feature follows from what I'm saying of fascism is indeed terror. Terror was based on the identification of the enemy and violent means to which they used to annihilate the enemy. And it's important to note here that while Italian fascism is sometimes considered less violent than Nazi rule, it still employed violent terror to rule in Italy and in the colonies, in the little colonies that Italy had at the time. And here I would like you to, I'm using this quote from the very esteemed historian Eric Hobsbawm as a transition point to discuss shortly the consolidation of Nazism in Germany. Hobsbawm argues without the triumph of Hitler in Germany in early 1933, fascism would not have become a general movement. And I think this goes on to show a bit the difference and the relation, rather, between fascism and Nazism. What Mussolini did in Italy is that it provided, as it were, a certain playbook on how to rule dictatorially. And it was a very specific playbook based on the elements I discussed earlier. What happened with the advent of the Nazis in power is that they, in a way, globalized this framework, and they actually turned it into a much more extreme direction. And this is a familiar topic for most of you. You have studied in school, so for some of you anyway. So I don't really, we will also discuss this in the next lecture. What I'd like to do now is basically give you a sense of the basic characteristics and also the divergences between Italian fascism and German Nazism. We can be talking all day about the conditions that led to Hitler's coming into power. Surely we must bear in mind the state that Germany is after the First World War. We talked about it. We also must bear in mind the effect of the global economic crisis. That's not the sole reason, but that also played a key role. And in the sense that it created, it gave Hitler an audience, as it were, for his own extreme ideology. And what was that? The Nazi regime was based on the idea of a quote-unquote Volksgemeinschaft. What do we mean by Volksgemeinschaft? A kind of society of the people, but the people were defined in a specific way. And the way they were defined was based on principles of racism and anti-Semitism. A turning point here is 2 years after Hitler comes into power. Again, he's appointed, the Weimar Republic in Germany, which is a functioning democratic pluralistic regime. It's being set after the end of the First World War, is having a lot of political problems. There's instability everywhere. The economic crisis makes it even worse. And finally, through a complicated set of events, Hitler is being, again, like Mussolini in some way, appointed as the chancellor by the then liberal, conservative mostly, president of the Republic. That happens in 1933. And after that, Hitler sets up a brutal regime, a regime that is more so than in the Italian one, based on the idea of the Aryan race, to put it simply. And so, in other words, what I want to say here is that much more so than any other dictatorial regime in Europe, the way the Germans, the Nazis, understand what it means to be a German is very racially based, and there's one big enemy, and that enemy are the Jewish populations in Germany and in Eastern Europe. At the same time, there is an expansioning project that goes, an ideology that also sets the difference between what the Nazis are doing and what other authoritarian regimes are doing. And this expansionist project doesn't only focus in places around Germany that contain German populations, but it exceeds that sphere, and it exceeds all the way through to Eastern Europe, and it's the famous idea of the Lebensraum. By Lebensraum, we mean space where, for Hitler, the German nation ought to expand and occupy, and that space was in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. Now, so in a nutshell, this is how the other side of the 20s and 30s we get to the consolidation of the Nazi rule over Europe. the Nazi rule, the consolidation of the Nazi party in Germany, that sets the foundation for the expansion of Nazis across Europe. And indeed, it also sets the principles for the beginning of a fruitful collaboration between Nazis and fascists. And in the next segment, we will focus on a few years after the emergence of Nazism in Germany, the consolidation of Nazi power in Germany. Spain becomes the main battleground for the competing ideologies of fascism and anti-fascism, and that's where we will be going in the third segment.